Welcome. Today we are going to talk about deontology. We're going to talk about universal ethical theories. Specifically, our attention is going to be on Kant and the categorical imperative.
And this becomes the main value of deontology. The idea that you have duties and obligations similar to notions of virtue ethics, that things might be good or bad in themselves, that there are universal situations. It's never okay to harm, to hurt, to destroy, but that there's value in individuals, that somebody has a dignity in their life, and it's just not a means to achieving a greater consequence for a greater number of people. And if this is where you're happening to side within this, deontology as a school is the greatest sort of idea. It is involved within this idea. The greatest champion of the deontology school is Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. Kant ends up advocating very clearly that nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification, except for a good will. That it is your will that is going to decide if something is good or bad. Is the idea of what you're willing a good thing, even if it doesn't happen, even if the outcome isn't great, the fact that you chose to do good, right? It's the thought that counts, is the idea that Kant is advocating for. The sight of being who is not adorned with a single feature of a pure and good will, he continues saying this, enjoying unbroken prosperity, can never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator, right? Anyone who is never good, even if they're winning, even if their life is great, isn't going to make anyone else an impartial, rational spectator happy. Becomes his argument here. Thus, the goodwill appears to constitute the indispensable condition, even of being worthy of happiness. Right? Most of us would say, that a drug kingpin who's only in it for themselves, etc., and harming other people, even though they might be in charge of countries, even though they might be wealthy, even though they might, have every sort of pleasure associated with them. Most of us would say that person is not good, that this is not a good thing because their will is not good, that they're not willing for good things. Therefore, it's not valuable, and this is what Kant is advocating for. He states that a good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition, of the will, that it is good in itself and is considered by itself to be esteemed much higher than all that can be brought about by it in favor of any inclination, nay, even the sum total of all inclinations, right? That the will itself becomes the thing that is valuable, that this is what we're wanting to do, that the will is where the heart of goodness is, and that it is where it is good in itself, is the argument of Kant. Kant ends up arguing that the will itself is something that's given to us by nature, and that we know from our will what items are going to be good and what items are going to be bad, what actions are beneficial and which ones are not, right? We have a rational will that's going to help us to decide all of that, right? So we have the will that's going to be the basis of deciding everything. If you're doing something out of a selfish motivation or out of a selfless idea, that if it's going to have value or not, that your will is going to be able to determine all of this on its own, and that this is going to be things that are going to be good in themselves as a result. So it's not about the ends in themselves, because our will is able to determine what the ends may or may not be, and why you're choosing something or not. Right? The will itself is going to be the determining factor on where morality is going to sit, contrary to what Mill is advocating, that it's about the consequences that's going to be coming out of that. Kant ends up advocating that though not the sole and complete good, this must be the supreme good and the condition for every other good, even that of the desire of happiness. Right? He's going to say, yes, that there might be consequences that are good. But if you didn't will things along the way, that the tyrant might enjoy their life, but they're not a good person because their will is not for the concerns of their people, etc. It says we have to develop the notion that the will, which derives to be highly esteemed for itself and is good without the view of anything further, that this is the way that we should look at and determine if actions are moral or immoral. Not if whether or not the consequences which follow, but what is it the intent? What is the will along these ways? And that this is going to give value for every other action. Right? He's clearly not a consequentialist. He's going to say that the second proposition, the second sort of argument, is that an action done from duty derives its moral worth, not from the purpose which it is attained by it, but by the maxim by which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition, the will, by which the action must take place, without regard of any other desire. Right? So again, he's very much advocating that it's not about the consequences, but about what the will is deciding. Choices cannot be justified by their effects, no matter how morally good the consequences might be. I can't kill an innocent person who's not even, to save the lives of 10 other people. This is not going to be okay, even if the consequences might be beneficial. Kant advocates that the preeminent good, which we call moral, can therefore consist in nothing other than the conception of the law in itself, which certainly is only possible by a rational being, insofar as this conception, and not merely that the expected effect, determines the will, right? Any beast, rational or irrational, knows if it's having pleasure, right? But the idea of what's causing this, what's leading to this, which is even what Mill was advocating, we need the higher sort, is based upon the idea of following this moral law. This law is the idea that Kant ends up advocating for. Everything else goes under it. It says the good which is already present in the person which acts accordingly. That this is what we're doing. We have this idea of the law in ourselves. And that this is the notion of an imperative. That this is the word that's going to be used to describe this. Now, imperatives, Kant wants to point out, come in two types. And they're expressed with the term ought, right? You ought to do this, you ought not to do that, right? So you ought to do your homework, you ought not murder people, right? We have this idea of ought being put in there. And then he says, right, they show that an objective law is in relation to reason. That this is what the term ought sort of implies. Now he's going to say that, again, they all come in two different ways. There are hypothetical imperatives and there are categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives represent like necessity. If you want to get a good job, you ought apply for it. Right, that you can't expect it, that doesn't happen, right? If you want the job, you have to apply, right? There's this sort of hypothetical condition. If you don't want a good job, then you don't need to have that, right? Hey, if you want to have a really good steak, you ought to eat at such and such a place, right? Because they've got really great steak. Okay, well, I'm not feeling like steak. I'm feeling more like tacos, whatever. So I'm gonna not go there, right? There's no moral condition, right? It's a hypothetical, one related to the other, right? If I want to do this, I ought to do that. It's an imperative, but we're not going to be talking about it with this sort of idea of having to have a moral component. Because it's, again, hypothetical. If you want this, you ought to do that. Categorical imperatives, though, are different because they are objects of necessity. There's not a maybe you don't want to do it. It is you ought to do it, and you ought not to do anything else. And this is a categorical answer on how you should move forward with this idea. Again, categorical imperatives. He states that the principle then, it is the supreme law. His categorical imperative, the famous categorical imperative that follows after Kant, is act always in such a maxim that thou can will at the same time become a universal law. That this is the sole condition under which a will can never contradict itself and is therefore categorical. So is it okay to lie? Well, can I will that lying is a universal law? Can I will that anyone can lie? No, I can't, because then truth has no value. There will be no trust. There'll be a breakdown of society. I won't even be able to talk to myself without lying, right? I cannot will that lying is universally okay. Therefore, lying is not okay. Can I will that killing somebody is okay? Well, in this case, I might want to kill so-and-so. Hey, it's good that I kill him. Right? Do you go back and kill baby Hitler? Right? That's a fun moral quandary some people have. If you had a time machine, would you kill baby Hitler? Utilitarians would definitely lead towards the yes argument, right? Consequentialists, yes. Bad man do bad. Get rid of him. Works out well. But Kant really says no, because while you might will to kill baby Hitler, you can't will that killing people is okay, because that would mean that killing any baby is okay. Killing any person is okay, and therefore it's not something we would universalize and make okay. And so this is going to change it, right? The will, even though the consequences might be great, even though the consequences might be beneficial for all of mankind, you cannot will to do such a bad thing. And because you cannot expect that it becomes a universal law. Now, there's a second sort of part of the categorical imperative, which is sometimes mentioned and sometimes not. And this is, he says, to act in regard that every rational being, thyself and others, that they always have a place in the maxim as an end in itself. Right? So act upon a maxim which at the same time has its own universality for every rational being. So every rational being would be able to approach this idea that you shouldn't lie, that you shouldn't kill. And therefore also every rational being must be treated as an end in itself. And this is the really tricky part for Kant and the categorical imperative for a lot of people. We might will that one action be okay. We might even will that an action become universalized. But are we using people as means or as ends? Right? And this might change the morality of a situation. This was one of the things that Kant advocated against notions of slavery for. He says that you're going to be treating people as means and not as ends in themselves. And since they are rational creatures, they are ends in themselves. Therefore, slavery of any type is not okay. Even if you might be able to find some sort of category where you might, say it's always been this way or something else, he says you're not treating people as ends in themselves, and therefore it is not morally acceptable. Now, this sort of question that a lot of people have with Kant and the categorical imperative is, can I phrase my maxim broadly or narrowly? Kant advocated that it needed to be very broad, right? Lie, kill, cheat, steal, etc. But a lot of people want to take from Kant and kind of narrow it down, right? I'm going to act in such a way that this can become a universal law, and I'm going to treat people as rational beings, as ends in themselves, but I'm going to have it be fairly narrow. Kant, again, wasn't a big fan of this, but you might be following Kant and narrow it, right? Can I will that lying in order to save a life is morally okay? Well, Kant wouldn't think this is an okay maxim. Many of us might say yes, because it's not going to break down law. We're not going to no longer trust anybody because there's moral value in saving a life. or in fact, we're going to be treating somebody as an end in themselves, and therefore it has this sort of value. And so this becomes part of this sort of debate amongst people who follow Kant on how you'd like to shape the categorical imperative. There are different sort of branches of thought off of this, different branches of deontological ethics, right? Remember, deontology means this idea that it is your duty, right? This ought is implied. This is where you're going to do it. And so there's the different branches that are all kind of based off of different interpretations on Kant, on the strongest idea, right? Something that you must do. And Kantianism kind of becomes the catch-all phrase for your main deontological moral systems. In fact, all of them claim to be Kantian. And there's really three major branches. You have your agent-centered, your patient-centered, and your constructuralist. Right? The agent-centered, each agent has obligations that they must follow, that they may be shared with others, but applies to them. Right? You have your own obligations that you must do. You have a relationship between a parent and a child and a spouse. Right? I have obligations if I only have one loaf of bread and my child is starving and your child is starving, I have obligations to my child. Therefore, my child gets it. Sorry. That sort of idea, right? This becomes this sort of idea. I have obligations, therefore I must do these obligations within this idea. The patient-centered, it's a rights-based rather than duty-based idea, right? We're really looking at this second part of the categorical imperative that we talked about, right? That you're treating people as ends and not as means. So how do you look at this, right? What rights do you have? You have these rights, and therefore I have a duty not to violate your rights. Where do your rights come from becomes another larger discussion. You have a right to life, therefore I don't have the right to kill you. Right? That your value exists in that way. Those obligations then interfere, right? You have a right to your property, therefore I don't have a right to take it. Therefore it's not moral for me to infringe upon your rights in taking that. And the final idea is the constructuralist, also known as the contraction. Morally wrong acts are on such accounts those acts that would be forbidden by principles that people in a suitably described social contract would accept. In other words, is this a rational thing? Right? We get the universalist idea that we're going to be constructing morally right and morally wrong arguments. So it's not just whether or not you would do that, but would everyone else agree with you on this idea? Right? Each of which are taking a different part of what Kant was advocating and promoting that. But this becomes the sort of main strength of Kantian or deontological ethics. So we end up having a big question about different moral practices. Are they right or are they wrong? I mean, there's certainly clear things like murdering is not okay. And as Kant already advocated, that things like slavery are not okay, primarily because you're treating people as means instead of ends. And the same thing would apply to subordination of women or anyone based upon who they are. Any subordination of another person, you're only treating them as a means to some other goal and not as an end in themselves. And they have moral worth as an individual, as a rational being, and therefore it is not okay to subordinate them in any way. Right? What about notions of polygamy? Thruples, quadruples, right? Is this okay? Polyamory, right? Any of these sorts of things. Are you treating the objects in this relationship as ends in themselves or as means? And this becomes kind of a fun, interesting idea of cultural value on how you're doing that. Certain cultures practice these things and don't value all of the members in this relationship equally. Some of them are means instead of ends, and therefore that wouldn't be okay. Could it be done the other way? Again, maybe with different cultural weight and value, then maybe it's okay. It becomes kind of a tricky sort of negotiation if we're going to look at things with Kant along this way. Lying, as a general rule, not okay, because we can't will that it becomes a universal law, but at the same time we might find things that we have to do to save a life. Does that change our category? Does that change our negotiations? And therefore, is it okay? Do you tell somebody, no, your food is horrible, I don't like it, thanks for asking, but it's horrible? No. Is that morally okay? Harming somebody, or is that lying? How do you find the right way to go along these ideas? Probably one of the biggest criticisms of Kant is that it's no fun. It doesn't allow for a lot of wiggle room, right? That you have obligations, you have duties, and you have to do your duty, regardless of what you might want to do. For instance, one of my colleagues, Dr. Cordon, says the example, do I throw a birthday party for my daughter because it is my duty as a father? It's not something that I want to do. Maybe I don't like my daughter. I do. I like my daughters. But, for the example of the begrudging, not happy father, well, I've got an obligation to my child to have them have a party and whatever. So I'm going to do it. I don't enjoy it. I'm just going to do it out of duty. Is that an okay thing to do? Is it better or is it worse? Right? And is there going to be joy and fulfillment found within this way? Or, right, I mean, we obviously, if the other option is do it because you love your daughter, then yes, that's good. But, right, find this sort of balancing act within all this. What do you do with things of morality that doesn't concern happiness, right? Or things that are other obligations, laws. Do you cheat on your taxes? Right? Right? They're too high anyway, so I don't want to pay anything. Blah, blah, blah. Right? It's my duty to help a little bit, but I'm not doing any more than I need to. These sorts of moral questions really kind of make Kant look like he's no fun, and therefore not things that you want to do. What if an action, is going to bring about great happiness for a large number of people? Do you get to do it then? Maybe, maybe not. Right, so this becomes the sort of questions wrapped up within Kantianism and drawbacks that it has. That things might have moral value in of itself, but can some of that get robbed if you're only doing it out of this idea of obligation and duty?
Right now, you should probably take a break from this video and go and watch the sort of recap argument between Mill and his notion of utilitarianism and Kant's notion of deontology. In that other video, you can kind of see the standard debate and argument between utilitarianism versus Kantianism. Again, is it about the consequence or is it about the motivations? So watch that video and that can help you understand the larger debate, the classic sort of debate that exists within a lot of people's minds of, does it matter about your intentions or does it matter about the outcome?
So where do we go? Where should we proceed from here? Does intent really matter? Or does the result matter more? Which one has greater value? Do you sacrifice your own happiness, as utilitarians might advocate, for others? Do you, give everything to the hedonist perspective, where it's just about pleasure and pain? Does the utility monster get to devour everything because their pleasure is greater than everyone else's pain, even though it's selfish and base? Do you enter into the experience machine just because the pleasures are good or not? Or do you have duties for other people? These become big questions. Probably, the heart of a lot of these moral issues is wrapped up in what becomes known as the trolley problem. The trolley problem imagines an out-of-control trolley that, if you do nothing, is going to go and kill 5 people. It's going to run over it and they're going to die. You happen to not be able to stop the trolley, but you can divert it. But by diverting it, you are the agent that is going to kill 1 person. Right? The consequences are different between letting 5 people die and killing 1. Your will is going to be looking at this differently, right? The utilitarian says sorry to the 1 person as a general sort of rule. But to Kant and a lot of your deontology, they say, no, you don't want to be the agent of murder. You can't will that killing somebody becomes a universal law. And therefore, you cannot pull the lever.
By now, you've probably realized that we've talked about Kantianism and we've understood the idea of duty versus the idea of consequences and where our morality is there. And we understand it in theory. MIT has created what they call the moral machine. And it's a series of sort of problems and test cases where you're going to choose one group or another. It actually has some real life application for self-driving cars and how those should be programmed and all of that. But it's also a great way for us to tease out the idea on whether or not it's about our duty and who that applies to and why one group of people might be more important to us than another group of people and how that should be. So there's a certain amount of this class time that I'm expecting you're going to go off and click around on this link for a little while and be prepared to discuss it and engage depending on how the class is formatted, either in discussion groups or assignments, or we might be doing this in class. And this video is there to let you know that we did this in class and navigated and discussed this with one another. So spend some time doing that. Of course, at its very basis, the issue of the moral machine goes down to what's classically known as the trolley problem. The trolley problem is the sort of thought experiment that exists between Kantianism and utilitarianism, or deontology and consequentialism. The question, the thought goes like this. There is a trolley that is heading down a hill. It's malfunctioned, it's broken. If you do nothing, it's going to run over and kill 5 people. But you happen to be standing near the lever, and what do? Do you pull the lever, which will derail it and change the trajectory of this trolley, saving 5 people, but in doing so, will run over and kill 1 person? Most people real quickly think, well, 1 person is better to lose than 5 people, but the difference is you're now the agent of that death. You are responsible for that 1 person's death. You are not responsible for the death of the 5 people. Is there a difference between pulling a lever versus pushing somebody and taking hands on them? Does it matter if it's somebody you know and love, or pieces of art, an animal? What if it's something that has deep significance to you, but is that more important than a person? The trolley problem, as you will see with MIT's moral machine, kind of helps tease out this idea and what is right and what is wrong and how we understand that and how we should go forward. Of course, coming to figure out, at least between, is it about the consequence or is it about the intent? Is it about me being the actor and responsible, or is it just about what actually happens? It really helps to clarify a lot of further discussions we're going to have with ethics going forward. You understand that some people will make a different answer from you, and it's not necessarily, again, because they're evil or stupid. They might be both, but they might just see things a little bit different or prioritize something slightly different than you. And what is the difference between pulling a switch and pushing somebody? Or who happens to be the product and down the line on one side or the other? And is there a number where it changes? If you say, no, I can't be responsible for it, I'm sorry 5 people have to die, does that change if it's 10, 20, 100, a million? What if they're bad people and the person who has to die is a good person? Does that change that? The moral qualities as well. So again, it's a fun sort of thought experiment, and you can run through all of these scenarios in your mind, and again, it'll help us move forward